Hey everyone, Ram from VAST Data here, and I want to walk you through something that we just launched, our MCP. So we have an MCP server. We'll talk about it, what an MCP server is, and we'll get through the setup of the MCP so you can get this running on your local machine so that you can actually go through and access parts of the VAST management system through an LLM. So I've kind of talked around an MCP. So let me describe what an MCP is, and a great place to start is the actual website, modelcontextprotocol.io. Goes through this, and here, so if we just take a look at this image, and in essence, an MCP sits between an LLM or an agent that uses an LLM, so any type of LLM application where you need to access external data. So normally when you want to build an application like a full stack application, front end and back end, you'll access data through APIs. LLMs do not know all the details about the APIs because they haven't been trained on all the different APIs. And that's what an MCP essentially helps you do. It kind of standardizes access to data for different environments. So whether you want to get data from a database, you want to get data from development tools, you want to get data from productivity tools. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to set up an MCP that sits between your coding editor. We'll look at Gemini, the Gemini CLI, and as well the VAST Data management system. So what you can do is you can actually connect to the actual VAST Data platform using an MCP, and just by prompting, you can ask questions about what's available in your cluster or to list specific things in your cluster, and it'll go and grab that information for you. So in this video, we're just going to go through the setup of the MCP, and then in a future video, we'll take a look at all the different use cases for using the MCP. And if you've had a chance to go through and take a look at the actual VAST management system, this is the UI for the VAST management system. We're not going to spend too much time here. The MCP will allow you to access information and to modify information available on the VAST management system. So if you want to take a look at your quotas, you want to list your clusters, you want to change or modify anything, you should be able to do that, or you will be able to do that through the MCP. So going back to the actual repo, it's available for you to install today. So if you go to VAST Data, so this is hosted on GitHub. So if you go to VAST Data and you look for VAST Admin MCP, so this is the administrator MCP, and it'll go through, and we're going to go through all the steps for you to install the VAST Admin MCP. Before we kind of go through and jump forward, there's a bit of introduction here. It talks about the versions of Python you should have. One thing to keep in mind is make sure that you're running the latest version of whatever tool you want to use the MCP on. In a previous attempt to do this, I noticed that I couldn't run the MCP on Visual Studio Code because I wasn't using the latest version. So the version I was on was only 3 months old, but it wasn't able to run the actual MCP server correctly. So make sure you're using the latest version of any tool. And next, we kind of go through the features. We're going to skip over this, and we're just going to jump in and install the admin MCP. So I'm going to go through these steps, step by step. And the one thing to keep in mind is to actually access any data, you're going to need to go through the setup step where you pass in, for example, your cluster information, your username, password, and so forth. And that's the same information that you would pass in to access the VAST management system UI. So whatever you use to log in here would be the same thing you would pass to the MCP. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll walk through those steps in a second. And after we set it up, next thing we're going to do is actually configure the MCP server. So I'm going to first try this out on Gemini, and then I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio Code and just to make sure the MCP server is working in both places. And also you can get the steps to set up the MCP server for the different AI assistants. So here we have support for Cursor, Claude Desktop, Windsurf, VS Code. And the setup is going to be quite similar, just a matter of where are you actually adding the configuration. And in most cases, this is what the configuration is going to look like. You're going to pass in the MCP server name, the command, and the arguments. Let's go back to the setup and let's go ahead and install the MCP server. So I'm going to take this command. I'm just going to do the pip install in my terminal. So I'm going to move over to the terminal, and I'm just going to do this inside of a folder for now. So we're going to do test MCP, and there's nothing in this folder, so I'm just going to run pip install VAST Admin MCP. So another thing to keep in mind, you can also consider installing this globally. So now let's just do VAST Admin VAST Admin MCP. Here we have like all the different things we can do. The VAST Admin MCP. So this is very similar to kind of typing in like the help command or just like what to do when you get started. And let me go ahead and run the setup. So I'm going to do VAST Admin MCP setup. And this is going to ask you for all this available information. So we're going to add a new cluster. And then as well, it's going to test your connectivity. So one thing to note is I already added this information before for this previous cluster. So I'm just going to remove the cluster and add it again just to make sure everything is working. So I'm going to remove cluster that we just accessed and that we just saw. And now let's go ahead and add a new cluster. So again, the first thing we have to do is we have to put in the actual cluster address. And then we have to go in and add, so I'm just going to add my username. And let me just double check my username going back to the browser. So it's first name dot last name, and this is my password. And it says cluster admin user detected. Which tenant do you want to use? I'm not going to specify tenant for now. I'm just going to use default. And the next thing we want to do is just go to option 4 and test cluster connectivity. So we're going to select the cluster we want to test connectivity for. And it says, okay, there we go. Successfully connected to VAR 202. So this is our actual lab environment that we build on test.on locally, and tells you the build version, and it tells you the user for that build. So before we jump out of here, let's just make sure we save and exit, capture everything. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add this MCP server to Gemini. I want to make sure that we're adding this one that we just installed, or this MCP that we just installed here. So let me go ahead and do VAST Admin MCP, and we want to run MCP setup. So that's the command we want to run next. So it's going to be VAST Admin MCP, and then we're going to do MCP setup. And we need to specify the tool. So I'm going to do this in a few places. I'm just going to do the Gemini CLI for now. And I think this was just recently added. So here is what we need to add. And we need to add it to this file. So here are all the steps we need to do so that we can actually use the MCP within an LLM environment or within an agentic workflow. So here is the config that I need to update. So I'm just going to go ahead and update this. So let me close the instance of Gemini that I have running. And I'm going to go into this file. Here is the Gemini settings that contain the MCP server. And all I'm going to do is just update the command, which is the location of the MCP server. So in this case, it's not going to be on Cosmos Labs. I'm going to go switch over to the tabs. It's going to be under Test MCP. So let me just update Test MCP. Test MCP. We're going to save these changes. And now we're going to jump back into Gemini. I think I'm using Gemini from NPX. So I'm just going to grab Gemini once more to get the latest version of Gemini. So while that's installing, I just want to take a look at the other steps so I can install so I can install the actual MCP server on VS Code as well. So here are the steps for installing it on VS Code. So all this is available through the CLI in terms of where you have to go and what you have to add. But now I'm just jumping back to Gemini. And what we're going to do first is kind of just do like a simple test prompt to make sure that the LLM is working. It says that it has one MCP server registered. So I'm assuming that this MCP server is actually running in the background and we can actually access it. So I'm going to say list all my available clusters. So let's just do list all clusters instead, just to make sure the MCP server is working. Okay, so it came back and it says, oh, I need to run the MCP server. And let's allow it to do it for this session. So here it's going to list all of the available clusters, and here's all the information for that cluster. So it tells you what the JSON looks like and then actually puts it in a table format. So now we've gone ahead and installed the actual MCP server and we've tested it out on Gemini. Let's hop over to Visual Studio Code and make sure it's working there as well. So I'm just going to go back to the settings, and here are the setup or the configuration we need to add. And the only thing I'm going to take here is just the location, because the location of the MCP server I had before is different from this one, but all the rest of the configuration will be the same. Jump over to Visual Studio Code, and here is the MCP server that I was using before. So I'm just going to update the location to the one we just installed. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and ask a question. But before we do that, let's just make sure the MCP server is loading. So I'm just going to go to MCP servers. Here is the MCP server. Let's just make sure at the bottom we can actually show output from the server. The server's not running, so that's something to keep in mind. We want to start the server to make sure it's running. So here it's showing that the MCP server is running in the background. And now we're going to go back and ask a question. So let's open chat. I think chat's right here. Let's expand chat. There we go. So we do have access to MCP resources here. So I'm just going to say list all clusters. List all clusters. And let's see what it does. It's asking to run the actual MCP, and we're going to say allow in this session to run the MCP. And here is all the cluster information available to us. So in this video, what we did is we talked about what MCPs were. We went through the actual VAST Admin MCP, which allows you to access information related to your VAST cluster. So we went through the setup, we talked about MCPs, and we tested out the MCP in Gemini and as well in Visual Studio Code. So we went through and we set it up in this video. And in future videos, we're going to take a look at all the different use cases and some more interesting use cases of using the MCP to look at specific pieces of information from your VAST cluster, and as well to see how we can actually configure and modify and change the VAST cluster through the MCP.